I was standing there at gate B17, minding my own business, when this woman in designer luggage and an attitude the size of Texas started yelling at me about how I was holding up the entire boarding process with my walking cane. What she didn't know was that I just spent 37 years as a high school principal. I'd dealt with entitled teenagers, helicopter parents, and district bureaucrats who thought they ran the world. But this lady? She was about to get an education she'd never forget. Because when she demanded that I move my ancient bones faster, every single passenger within earshot heard her. And that's when I realized something beautiful was about to happen. The other travelers weren't just going to stand there and watch a 72-year-old veteran get bullied. Oh no, they had something much more creative in mind. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this situation. My name's Robert, but most folks call me Bob. I'm 72, a Korean War veteran, and like I mentioned, I spent nearly 4 decades shaping young minds as a high school principal. These days, I walk with a cane thanks to some shrapnel that decided to remind me of its presence after all these years, plus a knee replacement that didn't go quite as smoothly as the doctor promised. I was flying from Phoenix to Chicago that Tuesday morning in March. My grandson Tommy was graduating from Northwestern with his engineering degree, and wild horses couldn't have kept me from being there. My late wife Margaret had always said education was the greatest gift we could give our children, and seeing Tommy walk across that stage was going to be one of the proudest moments of my life. The flight was scheduled for 10:30 a.m., which meant I'd arrived at Sky Harbor Airport at 8:15 plenty early, just like Margaret used to insist. Better to wait at the gate than miss your flight, she'd always say. Some habits die hard, even 3 years after losing her. I'd checked in online the night before and printed my boarding pass on the old printer in my den. Group 3, seat 14A, a window seat I'd specifically requested because, at my age, you appreciate the view and you definitely appreciate not having to get up every time someone needs to use the restroom. The terminal was buzzing with the usual mix of business travelers, families with screaming toddlers, and folks like me who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I found a seat near the gate, settled in with my coffee and the crossword puzzle from the morning paper, and watched the controlled chaos of modern air travel unfold around me. That's when I first noticed her. She was probably in her early 40s, blonde hair pulled back in what my granddaughter would call a messy bun, wearing one of those athleisure outfits that probably cost more than my monthly medication bill. She had this way of carrying herself that screamed, "The world revolves around me," and she was dragging behind her one of those expensive hard-shell suitcases that probably weighed more than my old combat pack. She'd been pacing around the gate area for the better part of an hour, constantly checking her phone, sighing loudly at nothing in particular, and shooting dirty looks at anyone who had the audacity to exist in her general vicinity. I recognized the type immediately. In 37 years of dealing with parents at school events, you learn to spot the ones who think their time is more valuable than everyone else's. But I minded my own business, sipped my coffee, and focused on my crossword. 7 letters for patient endurance. Stamina. That seemed appropriate. At 10:00 a.m., the gate agent announced that boarding would begin in 15 minutes. I folded up my newspaper, finished my coffee, and started the slow process of getting myself organized. At 72, with a bum knee and a cane, you don't just jump up and go anywhere. Everything takes a little planning, a little patience. That's when I heard her voice for the first time. Seriously?" she said into her phone, loud enough for half the gate area to hear. "They haven't even started boarding yet. I don't know why these airlines can't figure out basic scheduling. Some of us have important connections to make." I glanced over and saw her rolling her eyes dramatically while talking to whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the other end of that call. She was standing right next to the priority boarding sign, tapping her designer sneaker impatiently against the floor. "No, Kevin, I can't just relax. You know I have that presentation at 2 o'clock. If this flight is delayed even 15 minutes, I'm going to miss my connection in Chicago, and then what? The whole Morrison account could be in jeopardy because these people can't run an airline properly." I found myself wondering if Kevin was her husband, boyfriend, or just some poor colleague who'd made the mistake of answering her call. Either way, I felt sorry for him. At 10:15, the gate agent picked up her microphone. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're now ready to begin boarding flight 1247 to Chicago. We'll start with our premium passengers, followed by Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. I slowly stood up, getting my balance with the cane, and started making my way toward the boarding area. Not rushing. Mind you, I knew I was Group 3, and they hadn't even called Group 1 yet. But at my age, you don't wait until the last second to start moving. Every step takes a little more consideration than it used to. That's when I felt someone push past me, bumping my shoulder hard enough that I had to catch myself with my cane. "Excuse me," came that same voice I'd heard complaining on the phone. But she wasn't saying it apologetically. She was saying it like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I turned around and there she was, designer lady, looking at me with the kind of expression you'd give a piece of gum stuck to your shoe. "Were you planning on moving anytime soon?" she asked, gesturing impatiently toward the boarding line. "Some of us actually have places to be." Now, I've been around long enough to know when someone's looking for a fight, and I've been around even longer to know that most of the time, it's not worth engaging. So I just nodded politely and said, "They haven't called my group yet, miss. I'm just getting ready." She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my cane with obvious disdain. "Well, maybe next time you should get ready a little faster. The rest of us shouldn't have to wait while you figure out how to walk." The words hit me like a slap across the face. In all my years through war, through decades of dealing with difficult people, through losing my wife, I couldn't remember the last time someone had been so casually cruel about something I couldn't control. But before I could even process how to respond, she'd already turned away and was pushing her way toward the front of the boarding area, muttering something under her breath about old people and why they even bother traveling anymore. I stood there for a moment, feeling that familiar burn of anger and humiliation that comes when someone decides to make your physical limitations their personal inconvenience. The rational part of my brain, the principal part, told me to let it go, to focus on Tommy's graduation, to not let one miserable person ruin what should be a wonderful day. But the human part of me, the part that had earned the right to exist in public without being treated like a burden, was getting ready for a fight. I had no idea that within the next 30 minutes, I wouldn't be fighting alone. The gate agent called for premium passengers in Group 1 to begin boarding. I watched as designer lady immediately stepped forward, fishing through her expensive handbag for what I assumed was her boarding pass. But here's where it got interesting. The gate agent scanned the first few passes without any issues, but when designer lady stepped up to the scanner, I heard a beep. Not the good beep, the bad beep, the something's not right here beep. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the gate agent said politely. "Could you step aside for just a moment? I need to check something." Designer lady's face immediately flushed. "Check something? What do you mean, check something? I'm premium boarding. I paid extra for this." "I understand, ma'am. If you could just step over here with me." But instead of stepping aside, designer lady raised her voice. "No, I will not step aside. I am supposed to be in the first group. I have a very important connection to make, and I cannot afford any delays because of your system problems." The gate agent, bless her heart, maintained her composure. She was probably 25 years old, with the kind of professional smile that comes from dealing with difficult passengers all day long. "Ma'am, I just need to verify your boarding group. It'll only take a second. My boarding group is premium. I specifically paid for premium boarding." Designer lady was starting to attract attention from other passengers. "I don't know what kind of incompetent system you're running here, but I need to get on this plane right now." From where I was standing about 10 feet away, I could see the gate agent looking at her computer screen with a confused expression. She typed something, waited, typed something else. Then she looked up at designer lady with a very carefully neutral expression. "Ma'am, according to our system, you're actually in Group 4. Your boarding pass shows." "That's impossible." Designer lady snatched the boarding pass back from the agent's hand. "I specifically selected premium boarding when I booked this flight. This is unacceptable." Now, I've been around long enough to know the difference between a legitimate mistake and someone trying to pull a fast one. And the way designer lady was acting defensive, aggressive, refusing to step aside, it was setting off every alarm bell I'd developed over decades of dealing with teenagers trying to talk their way out of trouble. The gate agent was clearly trying to handle the situation diplomatically, but designer lady was having none of it. She started waving her boarding pass around like it was a weapon, her voice getting louder and shriller with each word. "I don't care what your computer says. I am getting on this plane first, and if you have a problem with that, I want to speak to your supervisor right now." That's when I noticed something interesting happening around me. The other passengers weren't just watching this spectacle unfold, they were starting to get annoyed. Really annoyed. A businessman in his 50s, holding what was clearly a legitimate premium boarding pass, cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me, but some of us actually did pay for premium boarding, and we'd like to get on the plane." An elderly woman with a walker, who was obviously struggling to stand in line, shifted her weight and said to her husband, "Harold, didn't she just complain about that gentleman with the cane taking too long?" And that's when I realized that designer lady's little performance from 15 minutes earlier hadn't gone unnoticed. Several people had heard her nasty comments about me being too slow, and they were starting to connect the dots. Designer lady, oblivious to the growing hostility around her, continued her tirade at the gate agent. "I travel constantly for business, and I have never been treated so poorly by an airline. This is discrimination. I'm going to report you to corporate." The gate agent, still maintaining her professional composure, tried once more. "Ma'am, if you could just step aside, I can help resolve this issue while we continue boarding other passengers." "No, I am not stepping aside. I am getting on this plane right now." And that's when the businessman with the legitimate premium pass stepped forward. "Actually, no, you're not," he said calmly but firmly. "Because the rest of us have been waiting patiently, and we're not interested in your drama." Designer lady spun around to face him, her eyes blazing. "Excuse me? Who do you think you're talking to?" "I'm talking to someone who just spent 10 minutes complaining about an elderly gentleman with a cane moving too slowly, and now you're holding up the entire boarding process with your tantrum." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Designer lady's mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish gasping for air. She clearly wasn't used to being called out so directly. That's not. I have every right to." "You have the right to board with your actual group," interrupted the elderly woman with the walker. "Just like the rest of us." And that's when I saw it happen. Something beautiful and terrible and absolutely inevitable. The other passengers weren't just getting annoyed anymore. They were getting organized. The businessman stepped aside to let the legitimate premium passengers board, but he didn't move far. He positioned himself right where designer lady could see him, arms crossed, waiting. The elderly woman with the walker did the same thing. A young mother with a baby in a stroller moved closer. A college-aged kid with a backpack stopped scrolling his phone and started paying attention. They were forming a wall of human disapproval, and designer lady was trapped right in the middle of it. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "I paid for premium boarding." The gate agent, who had been typing furiously at her computer, looked up with an expression that was carefully professional but unmistakably final. "Ma'am, I've checked your reservation 3 times. You purchased a basic economy ticket with standard boarding. You're in group 4, which will be called shortly. I'm going to need you to step back and wait for your group to be called." The color drained from designer lady's face. That's impossible. I always buy premium boarding." "Perhaps you forgot to select it during booking," the gate agent suggested diplomatically. "It happens sometimes." But I could see it in designer lady's eyes the moment she realized she'd been caught. Maybe she really had forgotten to upgrade. Maybe she'd tried to bluff her way into an earlier boarding group. Either way, she was busted, and everyone knew it. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "Fine, but this is absolutely unacceptable customer service." She grabbed her expensive suitcase and started to stomp back toward the seating area. But here's where it got really interesting. Nobody moved out of her way. The businessman with the premium pass was now boarding the plane, taking his sweet time to organize his carry-on. The elderly woman with the walker was moving toward the gate, but at the pace of someone who was in absolutely no hurry. The young mother was adjusting her baby's blanket with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for museum artifacts. Every single person was moving just slowly enough that designer lady couldn't push past them. Every single person was taking just long enough with their boarding process that she was trapped in a crowd of people who had collectively decided they were done with her attitude. And the most beautiful part? They were doing it without saying a word. It was passive resistance at its finest, and I couldn't help but smile as I watched it unfold. These strangers had heard her insult me about being too slow with my cane, and now they were showing her exactly what too slow actually looked like. Designer lady tried to squeeze between the young mother and another passenger, but somehow there just wasn't quite enough room. She tried to go around the elderly woman with the walker, but the woman was having trouble with her boarding pass and needed to stop and reorganize her purse. "Excuse me," designer lady said loudly. "Excuse me." But nobody seemed to hear her. Or if they did, they were all suddenly very focused on their own boarding preparations. I watched this beautiful choreography of petty justice unfold for about 5 more minutes, as groups 1 and 2 boarded the plane at what had to be the slowest pace in aviation history. Designer lady grew more and more frustrated, checking her phone constantly, muttering under her breath about missed connections and incompetent people. And then the gate agent picked up her microphone again. "We're now ready to board group 3. That was my group. I started making my way toward the gate, taking my time not to be petty, but because that's just how I move these days. Each step careful and deliberate, my cane tapping against the terminal floor with a steady rhythm that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. As I approached the boarding line, I passed right by designer lady, who was still trapped in the crowd of slow-moving passengers. She looked up at me with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been recognition. And that's when I decided to say something. I stopped right next to her, leaned on my cane, and looked her straight in the eye. "You know," I said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear, "sometimes being patient is the fastest way to get where you're going." Then I continued toward the gate, where the agent scanned my boarding pass with a cheerful beep and a smile. "Have a wonderful flight, sir," she said. "Oh, I think I will," I replied, glancing back at designer lady one more time. "I think I will." But the story doesn't end there. Because as I was walking down the jet bridge toward the plane, I heard the gate agent make another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a slight delay in our boarding process, we're going to ask all remaining passengers to please have their boarding passes ready and move as quickly as possible to the gate." I couldn't help but chuckle. Designer lady was about to learn that when you're in group 4, and everyone in groups 1, 2, and 3 decides to take their time, you end up being the very last person to board the plane. Sometimes karma doesn't just come around. Sometimes it comes around with a sense of humor. I made my way down the narrow aisle of the plane, nodding to familiar faces from the gate area. The businessman with the premium pass gave me a subtle thumbs up. The elderly woman with the walker smiled and patted the empty seat next to her husband. Even the young mother with the baby looked up and nodded approvingly as I passed. It was like being part of a secret club, except the secret was that we'd all collectively decided that rudeness wouldn't be rewarded on our watch. I found my seat 14A, the window seat I'd specifically requested, and began the careful process of settling in. At 72, airplane seats seem to get smaller every year, but I managed to stow my cane, adjust my position, and get my seatbelt fastened without too much trouble. The middle seat next to me was occupied by a pleasant-looking woman about my age, reading a paperback novel. She looked up as I sat down and smiled warmly. "That was quite a performance at the gate," she said quietly, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I don't think I've ever seen such a beautifully coordinated response to bad behavior." "Sometimes people need to learn that actions have consequences," I replied, settling back into my seat. Though I have to admit, I didn't expect everyone to band together like that. "Oh, honey," she laughed, "you clearly don't travel much with us senior citizens. We've got time on our hands and very little patience for people who think the world owes them special treatment." I was about to respond when I heard a commotion coming from the front of the plane. Raised voices, the kind of frustrated discussion that usually means someone's day is about to get significantly worse. My seatmate and I exchanged glances. Without needing to discuss it, we both craned our necks to see what was happening. Designer lady had finally made it onto the plane, dragging her expensive suitcase behind her and looking like she'd just spent the last 20 minutes in personal combat with the entire boarding process. Which, in a way, she had. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. She was standing in the aisle about 6 rows ahead of us, having what appeared to be a heated discussion with a flight attendant. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught phrases like "this is unacceptable" and "I specifically paid for" and "I want to speak to the captain." The flight attendant, a woman who looked like she'd been dealing with difficult passengers since before designer lady was born, was maintaining the kind of patient, professional demeanor that comes from years of experience with people having public meltdowns. "Ma'am," I heard her say clearly, "I understand your frustration, but the seat you're claiming is currently occupied by another passenger who has a valid boarding pass for that exact seat." Designer lady's voice got louder. "I don't care what your computer says. I booked seat 8 specifically because I need a window seat for my medical condition. Medical condition. That was new. The flight attendant glanced at something on her tablet, then looked back at designer lady with an expression that was professional but unmistakably skeptical. According to our records, ma'am, your ticket is for seat 23C, which is a middle seat in our standard section. There's no notation of any special seating requirements or medical needs. That's because your system is obviously malfunctioning. Designer lady was now loud enough that half the plane could hear her. I always book window seats. I have claustrophobia. Now, I've been around long enough to know that claustrophobia is a real condition that affects real people in real ways. But I've also been around long enough to know when someone is using a convenient excuse to try to get what they want. The passenger in seat 8, a middle-aged man in a business suit who looked like he traveled for work regularly, spoke up calmly. "Excuse me, but I booked this seat 3 weeks ago, and I have the boarding pass to prove it." He held up his phone, showing his confirmation. "If there's been some kind of mistake with the airline's system, I'm happy to work with the flight crew to resolve it, but I'm not giving up a seat I legitimately paid for." Designer lady turned on him with the fury of someone who was used to getting her way and couldn't understand why the universe was suddenly refusing to cooperate. "You don't understand. I have a medical condition. I cannot sit in a middle seat." The flight attendant stepped in smoothly. "Ma'am, if you have a documented medical condition that requires special seating, we can certainly try to accommodate that. Do you have any documentation with you?" There was a pause. A long, telling pause where designer lady's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. I don't carry medical documents when I travel," she finally said. "That's ridiculous. Who carries medical documents?" "People with legitimate medical conditions that require special accommodations," said a voice from behind me. I turned around to see who had spoken, and I was surprised to find it was a woman in scrubs, clearly a healthcare worker heading home from or to a shift somewhere. "I'm a nurse practitioner," she continued in a calm, authoritative voice. "Patients with genuine claustrophobia severe enough to require specific seating accommodations typically carry documentation, especially when traveling. It's standard practice." The entire airplane had gone quiet. Even the baby that had been fussing earlier seemed to sense that something dramatic was unfolding. Designer lady's face went through several different shades of red and pink before settling on a kind of mottled purple that suggested she was realizing her latest excuse wasn't going to work either. "I shouldn't have to prove my medical condition to random strangers," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier conviction. The flight attendant maintained her professional composure. "Ma'am, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. But if you'd like us to accommodate a medical need, we do need some verification. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to take your assigned seat so we can complete boarding and push back from the gate on time." Designer lady looked around the airplane, as if searching for anyone who might take her side. What she found instead was about 150 passengers who had all witnessed some version of her performance over the past half hour and were collectively tired of the drama. The businessman from 8A spoke up again. "Look, if you genuinely have a medical issue, I'm willing to switch seats. But I'm not giving up my seat just because you're having a bad day and taking it out on everyone around you." That's when designer lady made her final, fatal mistake. "You people have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice rising to a near shout. "I am a platinum frequent flyer with this airline. I spend thousands of dollars a year on flights, and I will not be treated like some common passenger." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that comes right before lightning strikes. The flight attendant looked at her tablet again, scrolled through something, then looked back up at designer lady with an expression that was no longer professionally neutral. It was the expression of someone who had just discovered something very interesting. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "according to our records, this is actually your first flight with our airline. You opened your frequent flyer account yesterday." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Designer lady's face went completely white, then flushed red again, then seemed to cycle through every color in the spectrum as the full weight of being caught in yet another lie settled over her. That's not. Your system must be wrong," she stammered. But it was too late. She'd been caught lying about premium boarding, lying about medical conditions, and now lying about being a frequent flyer. The Credibility bank account was not just empty, it was overdrawn by about $1 million. The flight attendant straightened up and used the voice that flight attendants use when they've reached the end of their patience and the beginning of their authority. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to take your assigned seat immediately, or we're going to have to remove you from the aircraft. The threat of removal seemed to finally penetrate designer lady's wall of entitlement. She looked around the airplane one more time, met nothing but expressions of disapproval and disgust, and finally grabbed her suitcase with shaking hands. Fine, she muttered. Fine. This is the worst customer service I've ever experienced, and you can be sure I'll be filing complaints with everyone from the airline to the Better Business Bureau. She started stomping toward the back of the plane, dragging her suitcase behind her and muttering under her breath about lawsuits and corporate headquarters and how she was never flying with this airline again. As she passed my row, she glanced down and saw me sitting in my window seat, the seat I'd legitimately booked, paid for, and been assigned. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something in her expression that might have been recognition. Recognition that her problems had started when she decided to be cruel to an old man with a cane, and that everything that followed had been a direct result of that choice. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Sometimes the lesson teaches itself. She continued toward the back of the plane, and I heard the flight attendant announcing that we were finally ready to push back from the gate. My seatmate leaned over with a grin. Well, that was better than in-flight entertainment. I chuckled and settled back into my seat, looking out the window as the ground crew began preparing the plane for departure. But the story still wasn't over. Because about 10 minutes into the flight, just as we'd reached cruising altitude, I heard the flight attendant's voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior flight attendant speaking. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for your patience during our extended boarding process today. I also wanted to remind everyone that we're all sharing this space together for the next few hours, and a little kindness and consideration goes a long way toward making the journey pleasant for everyone. There was a brief pause, then she continued. To the passenger in 23C, the captain has asked me to inform you that your behavior at the gate and during boarding has been noted in our incident report. We hope the remainder of your flight will be more pleasant for both you and your fellow passengers. I couldn't help but smile. Even from 30,000 feet, karma was still making house calls. But the absolute best part came about an hour later, when the same flight attendant stopped by my seat. Excuse me, sir, she said quietly, leaning down so only I could hear. Are you the gentleman who was traveling to see your grandson graduate? I nodded, surprised that she remembered. Well, I wanted you to know that several passengers mentioned what happened at the gate, and how that woman treated you. The crew wanted to do something special to make up for that unpleasant experience. She handed me a small envelope. This is a voucher for a free upgrade on your return flight, with our compliments. And if you'd like, we can also arrange priority boarding for you. I opened the envelope and found a voucher that would have cost several $100s if I'd purchased it myself. That's very kind, I said, genuinely touched. But I have to ask, is this standard procedure? The flight attendant smiled. Let's just say that when passengers take care of each other the way everyone did today, we like to take care of them too. As she walked away, I settled back into my seat and looked out the window at the clouds passing below. In a few hours, I'd be in Chicago, watching my grandson accept his engineering degree. But right now, I was content to sit in my legitimately assigned window seat, surrounded by fellow passengers who had shown me that decency and justice were still alive and well at 30,000 feet. Sometimes the best journeys aren't just about where you're going. Sometimes they're about the people who choose to travel there with you. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Designer lady stayed in her middle seat in row 23, presumably wedged between two other passengers and experiencing the full reality of what she'd actually paid for instead of what she'd tried to bluff her way into. I spent the time thinking about Tommy's graduation, looking forward to seeing him walk across that stage, and occasionally chatting with my delightful seatmate, whose name turned out to be Dorothy. She was traveling to visit her new great-granddaughter, and we spent a pleasant hour comparing grandparent stories and marveling at how fast the world seemed to change around us. About 30 minutes before landing, I excused myself to use the restroom. As I made my way up the aisle, using my cane to steady myself, I couldn't help but notice that designer lady was looking miserable. She was cramped between a large man who was snoring loudly and a woman who had claimed both armrests and seemed determined to keep them. She looked up as I passed, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been remorse in her eyes. But then she turned away and stared out the window, and the moment was gone. When I returned to my seat, Dorothy leaned over with a conspiratorial whisper. I just heard something interesting from the flight attendant, she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Oh? Apparently, our friend back there has been asking about changing her return flight. Seems she wants to fly with a different airline. I chuckled. Can't say I blame her. This probably wasn't the flying experience she was hoping for. Well, here's the thing, Dorothy continued, clearly enjoying herself. The flight attendant checked, and because she booked the cheapest possible ticket, she can't change airlines without paying a significant penalty. Plus, it's a busy travel week, so most other flights are booked solid. The implications of this sank in slowly. You mean she's stuck flying back with the same airline? Not just the same airline, Dorothy grinned. The same crew. Apparently, they're working the return route too. I had to admit, there was a certain poetic justice to that. Designer lady was going to have to face the same flight attendants she'd been rude to, on a plane full of passengers who had witnessed her behavior and wouldn't soon forget it. We landed in Chicago right on schedule, and the pilot came over the intercom with the usual announcements about gate information and connecting flights. But then he added something that made me smile. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. I also want to personally thank the passengers who showed such kindness and patience during what could have been a difficult boarding process. Your courtesy toward your fellow travelers is exactly the kind of behavior that makes flying a pleasure for everyone involved. As we taxied to the gate, I could see other passengers nodding and smiling at each other. There was a sense of shared satisfaction, like we'd all been part of something bigger than just a flight from Phoenix to Chicago. When we finally reached the gate and the seatbelt sign went off, the usual chaos of deplaning began. But I noticed something interesting. Passengers were taking their time, being extra courteous, making sure elderly passengers and families with children had plenty of space to get their belongings and exit the plane. And designer lady? She was stuck in her middle seat until almost everyone else had deplaned, which meant she was probably going to miss whatever connection she'd been so worried about. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave, the senior flight attendant stopped by one more time. Mr. Robert, she said, apparently she'd learned my name from the upgrade voucher. I hope you have a wonderful time at your grandson's graduation. Thank you, I replied. And thank you for handling that situation so professionally. I know it couldn't have been easy. She smiled. Actually, it was easier than usual. When passengers support each other the way you all did today, it makes our job much simpler. We get to focus on taking care of people instead of managing conflicts. As I made my way off the plane, I reflected on the events of the morning. What had started as an unpleasant encounter with someone's bad attitude had turned into a masterclass in how decent people respond when they witness injustice. Nobody had planned what happened at the gate. Nobody had organized a slow down or coordinated a response. It had been organic, spontaneous, and beautiful in its simplicity. A group of strangers had decided that cruelty wouldn't be rewarded on their watch, and they'd found a way to make their point without being cruel themselves. I made it through the Chicago airport without any further drama, caught a taxi to Northwestern's campus, and spent the next 2 days watching my grandson collect his engineering degree and celebrating with family. It was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more. But the real epilogue to this story came a week later, when I was back home in Phoenix, checking my email. I had received a message from the airline's customer service department. Apparently, they'd received multiple positive comments from passengers on Flight 1247, all mentioning the professionalism of the crew and the exceptional behavior of their fellow passengers during what could have been a difficult situation. The email thanked me specifically for my grace under pressure and informed me that I'd been upgraded to their premium frequent flyer status, with benefits including priority boarding, free seat upgrades, and expedited customer service for the next year. But that wasn't the best part. The best part was the handwritten note that came with it, signed by Captain Martinez, the pilot of our flight. Dear Mr. Robert, it read, I've been flying for 32 years, and I've seen just about everything when it comes to passenger behavior. What I witnessed on Flight 1247 restored my faith in the basic decency of people. Your quiet dignity in the face of rudeness, and the way your fellow passengers rallied around you, reminded me why I love this job. Thank you for showing us all how to handle conflict with class. I hope your grandson's graduation was everything you hoped it would be. I kept that note on my refrigerator for months, and every time I looked at it, I remembered that sometimes the worst behavior in people can bring out the absolute best in others. A few weeks later, I ran into Dorothy at the grocery store. She was the delightful woman who'd sat next to me on the flight, and we'd exchanged phone numbers to stay in touch. "Bob," she called out from the produce section. "Did you hear what happened to our friend from the airplane?" I hadn't heard anything, so she filled me in with obvious delight. Apparently, Designer Lady had made good on her threat to file complaints with everyone from the airline to the Better Business Bureau. The problem was, in this age of social media and smartphone videos, several passengers had recorded portions of her meltdown at the gate. One enterprising college student had edited together a compilation video of her various lies and entitled it "When Karens Fly," a masterclass in how not to behave at the airport. The video had gone viral, racking up over 2 million views and thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of encountering entitled travelers. The best part, Dorothy continued, barely able to contain her laughter, is that someone identified her from the video. Turns out she works in marketing for a company that specializes in customer service training. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Her employer saw the video and issued a public statement distancing themselves from her behavior and emphasizing that her actions didn't reflect their company values, Dorothy went on. According to the news article one read, she's been placed on administrative leave while they conduct an internal review. I shook my head, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and genuine pity. That seems like a pretty severe consequence for one bad day. Maybe, Dorothy agreed, but you know what? Sometimes people need to learn that their actions have consequences. And maybe next time she's tempted to be cruel to someone just because she's having a bad day, she'll remember this experience and choose differently. As I drove home from the grocery store that day, I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of kindness and cruelty. Designer Lady's decision to be nasty to an elderly man with a cane had set off a chain of events that ultimately cost her much more than she ever could have imagined. But the kindness shown by my fellow passengers had created its own ripples. The airline crew felt supported and appreciated. Other passengers felt empowered to stand up against bad behavior. And somewhere out there, maybe people who saw that viral video learned something about treating others with respect. I never did see Designer Lady again, though I flew that same route several times over the following months to visit Tommy and his new job in Chicago. Each time, I was greeted by name by the flight crew, who remembered me and always made sure I felt welcome. On one of those flights, about 6 months later, I was settling into my usual window seat when a young woman in her 20s sat down in the middle seat next to me. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her phone and checking her boarding pass multiple times. "First time flying?" I asked gently. She nodded, looking embarrassed. "Is it that obvious? I'm terrified of flying, but I need to get to my sister's wedding, and this was the only way to make it there in time." I smiled and introduced myself. "Well, you picked a good flight. This crew is exceptional, and I'd be happy to talk you through what to expect if that would help." We spent the next few minutes discussing turbulence, takeoff procedures, and general aviation safety. By the time we were airborne, she was visibly more relaxed and actually enjoying the view from the window. "Thank you so much," she said as we reached cruising altitude. "You didn't have to help me, but you did anyway. That means a lot." "Everyone deserves to feel comfortable and safe," I replied. "We're all in this together." As I said those words, I thought about that day 6 months earlier when a plane full of strangers had decided they were, indeed, all in it together. When faced with someone determined to make the world a little bit meaner, they'd chosen to make it a little bit kinder instead. That young woman and I spent the rest of the flight chatting about her sister's wedding, her job as a teacher, and her plans for the future. When we landed, she thanked me again and said she was actually looking forward to her return flight. As I watched her walk away, confident and smiling, I realized that this was the real lesson from that day at Gate B17. It's not enough to simply avoid being cruel, sometimes we have to actively choose to be kind. We have to decide that other people's well-being matters, that decency is worth defending, and that we all have a responsibility to make the journey a little easier for our fellow travelers. Whether we're talking about airplane seats or life in general, we're all just trying to get where we're going. And the people who make that journey more pleasant, who offer help instead of hindrance, patience instead of pressure, kindness instead of cruelty, those are the people who make the world worth living in. I'm 72 years old now, and I've learned a lot about human nature over the years. I've seen the worst that people can offer, and I've been blessed to witness the best. What I know for sure is this: cruelty is easy, but it's temporary. Kindness takes more effort, but it lasts. That day at the airport, Faced with someone who chose cruelty, a group of strangers chose kindness. And in doing so, they reminded me that even in an age of increasing division and decreasing civility, there are still more good people than bad ones. They're just usually too polite to make a scene about it. Unless, of course, someone forces their hand. And sometimes, when they do make a scene, it's absolutely beautiful to watch. But you know what? There's one more chapter to this story that I think you'll appreciate. About a year later, I was back at Sky Harbor Airport, heading to Chicago again for Tommy's graduation from his master's program. The kid had decided to go for his MBA, and Margaret would have been so proud. I was sitting at the same gate B-17 waiting for my flight, when I noticed a commotion near the boarding area. A young mother with twin toddlers was struggling with her diaper bag, stroller, and two cranky kids who clearly didn't want to be at the airport. One of the twins had dropped his stuffed animal, and she was trying to juggle everything while other passengers walked around her like she was an obstacle course. I watched for a moment, remembering my own days of traveling with young children, back when Tommy's dad was just a little guy. Then I stood up, walked over, and picked up the dropped stuffed animal. "Looks like someone lost their friend," I said, handing it to the crying toddler. The little boy's face lit up as he clutched his bear, and his mother looked at me with the kind of grateful exhaustion that only parents of young children understand. "Thank you so much," she said. "I feel like I need 8 arms just to manage everything." "Been there," I smiled. "Mind if I help you get organized before boarding starts?" For the next 10 minutes, I helped her reorganize her bags, entertained the twins with my old principal tricks for managing restless kids, and even held one of the boys while she used the restroom before the flight. As we were chatting, she mentioned that she was nervous about flying alone with the twins. It was her first time taking them on a plane, and she was worried about bothering other passengers if they cried or got fussy during the flight. "Don't worry about that," I told her. "Most people understand that kids are just being kids. And the ones who don't understand? Well, that says more about them than it does about you." When boarding was called, I made sure she and the boys got on the plane without any problems. I helped her get settled in her seat, showed her where the extra supplies were kept, and even convinced one of the flight attendants to let her pre-board so she wouldn't feel rushed. My seat was several rows behind theirs, so I didn't interact with them much during the flight. But about halfway through, I heard one of the twins start crying, not the angry crying of a tantrum, but the tired, overwhelmed crying of a little kid who'd had too much stimulation for one day. I could see the mother getting more and more stressed, bouncing the crying child and apologizing to nearby passengers. A few people were shooting dirty looks in her direction, and I could see her starting to panic. That's when something beautiful happened again. The businessman sitting across the aisle, a different one than from my previous flight, but clearly cut from the same decent human being cloth, leaned over and offered to help. "I've got 3 kids of my own," he said quietly. "Sometimes a new face is all it takes." An elderly woman a few rows up turned around and started making funny faces at the other twin, who giggled and clapped his hands. A college-aged girl offered to help reorganize the diaper bag so the mom could focus on the crying child. Within 5 minutes, that plane had transformed from a collection of strangers into a community of people working together to help a stressed parent and 2 overwhelmed toddlers. The crying stopped. The boys settled down for naps. The mother actually relaxed enough to close her eyes for a few minutes. And I sat there in my seat, watching it all unfold, thinking about how this was exactly the opposite of what had happened a year ago with Designer Lady. Instead of one person making everyone else's day worse, everyone had worked together to make one person's day better. When we landed in Chicago, I helped the young mother get off the plane with all her gear. As we were walking through the terminal, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I can't thank you enough," she said. "I was so scared about this trip, but everyone was so kind. I actually can't wait to tell my husband how wonderful people can be." I smiled and patted one of the twins on the head. "People are generally good," I told her. "Sometimes they just need a little reminder of how to show it." As I watched her load the boys into their stroller and head toward baggage claim, I realized that this was the real ending to the story that started a year ago at gate B-17. Designer Lady's cruelty had brought out the best in a plane full of strangers, who decided that kindness was worth defending. And that experience had reminded all of us, including me, that we have the power to make someone else's journey a little easier, a little more pleasant, a little more hopeful. Every day, We get to choose whether we're going to be the person who makes the world a little bit meaner or a little bit kinder. We can be the designer lady, focused only on our own convenience and comfort, demanding that the world accommodate our bad mood and poor planning. Or we can be the businessman who gives up his time to help a struggling parent. We can be the elderly woman making faces at cranky toddlers. We can be the college student offering to reorganize a diaper bag. We can be the kind of people who see someone struggling and think, how can I help? Instead of how is this inconveniencing me? I'm 73 years old now, and I've seen enough of life to know that we don't always get to choose what happens to us. Flight delays, rude people, unexpected challenges, they're all part of the human experience. But we always get to choose how we respond. We can respond with entitlement and anger, demanding that the world bend to our will and taking our frustrations out on people who are just trying to do their jobs or get through their day. Or we can respond with patience and kindness, recognizing that we're all just fellow travelers trying to get where we need to go, and that the journey is a lot more pleasant when we help each other along the way. That day at the airport taught me that there are a lot more good people in this world than bad ones. They're just usually too busy being quietly decent to make headlines or viral videos. But when push comes to shove, when they see someone being cruel to an elderly person, or someone struggling with young children, or anyone who needs a helping hand, they step up. They form quiet coalitions of decency. They engage in subtle acts of resistance against meanness. They choose community over conflict, kindness over cruelty. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to witness it, it's absolutely beautiful to watch. The flight attendant from that original flight was right. When passengers take care of each other, it makes everyone's job easier. When people choose to be decent to one another, the whole world works a little bit better. So the next time you're traveling, whether it's through an airport, through a difficult day, or just through life in general, remember that you have a choice. You can be designer lady, making everyone around you miserable because you're having a bad day. Or you can be one of the quiet heroes who makes the world a little bit better, one small act of kindness at a time. Trust me, the view is much better from the second option. And who knows, you might just inspire someone else to choose kindness too. After all, we're all in this together.